Thank you, everybody, for joining the Bass Fug podcast. Today, we have a very special guest. Christian Craig Robinson, a.k.a. Capital K, is on the show with us today. How are you, Christian?
I'm very well, thank you. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, no problem. These things are always corny, but you got to start somewhere, right? Okay.
Oh,
yeah.
Basic.
So, you're known, I think, for Capital K, but I think you're doing other stuff as different artist names as well, right?
Yeah, I mean, I've been producing music as Capital K. That was essentially my producer name. I started making electronic music as a sort of bedroom producer, and then over the years, I graduated to doing lots of studio recordings. So I sometimes appear under my own name as Christian Craig Robinson. Sometimes I appear as Capital K when I'm involved in productions. I quite often join projects that come through the studio and do bits of collaborations live with those as well. You know, I did an album under the name of Loose Meat a couple of years ago, more sort of like electro disco album. I'm just about to start touring with a band called Soccer 96, playing bits of bass, but I do like bits of studio recording with them as well. And then I'm part of this whole music scene of London where we all tend to sort of swap around and play in each other's bands quite a bit. You know, so that's there's all sorts of things going on other than the name Capital K, but that's kind of like what I'm known as a producer.
Very prolific.
Yeah. I'm definitely prolific.
How did you start? Like, what were your beginnings? Like, take us from the beginning when you first were inspired to get into music all the way to where you are now.
Well, I think, the beginnings, like most people my generation, was 4-track demos. You know, I grew up really I was quite creative with my hands. I was doing a lot of stuff that I like pottery and things like that. But then I found, because the schooling got a bit rigid, I couldn't be so free. And then I discovered making music was a way to be quite free. And then I got into 4-track recordings quite early. And then I started sort of feeling a bit not so satisfied with playing guitar and stuff, but then I discovered a sampler and I started chopping up 4-track recordings with an old sampler. That got me into making just, electronica. I had a couple of releases out with sort of first Planet Mu and then XL, who put out these sort of like bedroom things I was making. But at the same time as that, I was getting access to studios and some old friends, from childhood. They had access to studios, so I just started messing around with studios, as quite, at the same time as chopping up home recordings, and that's how the whole thing got started.
What was because we are also a what's the terminology? A gearhead podcast. What was the first sampler you had? I
had EMU ESI 32, nice. And I did the first album with 8 megabytes, and then I got enough of an advance for my second album to get 32 megabytes, and I got I had a Fostex, was it R108, the 8-track recorders, and you could sync them up with an Atari to the ESI 32. So basically I would have 8-track digital running. And the great thing about those early digital recorders is you could just chop and, copy and paste bars, so you could perform in something over a couple of bars and then just copy and paste that, across, for 5 minutes, whatever. Or reverse them. So but the early setup was a Atari STE 520, EMU ESI 32, and a Fostex 8-track all synced together.
Nice. That's classic.
And I have to say, like, mixing with like no compression or anything, just what was the inherent, compression of those sort of like pieces of equipment, and then mixing down to DAT tapes, of course.
What software were you using on the Atari ST?
Oh yeah, old Cubase actually.
Oh, so, wow.
Yeah, the original sort of Cubase, that probably the crack that everyone had at those times in the Atari.
Yeah, with the cool intro music. Are you still using the Atari now, or do you use your
I mean, it's ironically enough. I mean, I actually got it out of storage not too long ago, and I've been powering it up and looking into trying to do it, but I'm trying to locate a box of floppy disks that I put somewhere in storage. Wow. I've not found them, but I know that in there somewhere is the software. So now I do everything in terms of sequences. I use actually a digital performer still, which like not so many people in the UK use, and Ableton for home sketching, but my recording device now is a digital performer actually, and 8-track tape. I have to say, still sometimes, occasionally.
Oh wow! Why the 8-track tape?
We got an old Atari MX5050 tape machine, and just still sometimes work with that on some records. You know, basically sort of like getting a live band down to 8 tracks on tape. Yeah, you'd be not to glamorize that. That doesn't happen too often. Everyone's so brave.
Well, a lot of people still stick with. They're kind of going back and sticking with what was working. I was speaking with Alec Empire, the guy from Atari Teenage Riot, and he says that every new album they still use the same Atari ST. I was like, wow, that's actually really cool.
It's. I know people get really obsessive about these sort of things, but the clocking of those old machines is great, and I think it's the same reason why a lot of people enjoy using hardware now, is just the way it clocks and the way everything syncs together. There's something that you get in that I think people sense is different to using the clocking in a sort of computer-based piece. If you're working with electronic music, that is.
Yeah.
And it's just something that I think over time, as you get used to listening to stuff and deeper into it, you start to understand the feel of how these things feel different. When you're making music.
Mm. And I notice on some of your albums, there's I hope I'm right when I say this, but there's some songs where it doesn't sound like it's quantized. It's because there's a good kind of sort of rhythm to it. Is that hard to do on the Atari, or?
Well, the early, I guess earlier albums, I was working a lot with sort of making up samples of things that were, and quite a lot of time I would be making up loops of beats, but then triggering them with MIDI to sort of to velocity sensitive. So, you were biting at different points in the loop depending. So I've always been quite into, I came from a background of playing in quite noisy bands, and I liked quite discordant music. So I was into sort of more broken up sort of rhythm like that. What I do a lot these days is I have a lot of odd drum machines or things that I perform into, I perform in the pieces, or I'll play in by hand, the actual electronic layer, over a couple of minutes of the track. And then I'll only sort of repair the bits where maybe I was generally a bit shonky in my performance, but I try to sort of keep things performative, So not everything, things are quite sort of, in terms of the stuff that's sort of been sampled in or played in, or, drum machines, they tend to have quite a lot of movement in them.
Am I correct in saying that you're a fan of the Roland 707?
Yeah. Oh, well, I've never used a real one.
Okay.
But I have used, and in fact, I use, in terms of samples, the last couple of years, I've been using lots, a set from the SP12 and a lot of the old Drummatics sequential circuits, and I use a lot of these old drum machine sounds because they've got like a nice, people recognize them, they're homely to people when they hear them in a track, but then I treat them quite a lot, and I'm treating them a lot through outboard or through a desk, or with different kinds of distortions or reverbs, or so I treat like a drum machine's samples like I would a drum kit I'd recorded. I would then mix it.
What kind of board are you running this stuff through?
Well, at the moment, we've got it's a Chiltern desk. It's like probably early 80s British-made broadcast desk, phenomenally overbuilt. It's like an over-engineered piece of equipment, but it sounds incredible. But all my recent stuff, I think the ones I've been doing recently, almost every single layer gets played back through different bits of outboards. Now I'm running quite, big complex studio setup. So, I put things through things like the Culture Vulture, the Phoenix Culture Vulture. We got like one of the a Zener compressor, which has got that lovely diode, so I'm always mixing the drum bus through that. I'm using a lot. I've got 2 different spring reverbs, so I'm always recording in layers of stuff going through that. And then actually what I'm using quite a lot now is I've got the old there's the old Roland SP, is it 202, like the first early Roland hand sampler.
Yeah. The red one.
Yeah, I run layers of stuff in and out just through the phonos in and outs of that, just to use the inboard filter on that, So like sometimes I'm putting a keyboard mix or something through, or a drum mix through an old filter that I'm just tweaking gently as we go through the track. But then that could be running back into like a valve preamp to give it some nice crunch, and then I'm just recording all that back in, so I'm always sort of getting my mixes down to like an essential bunch of groups. So in the end, I'll have a stereo mix of the drums, a stereo mix of the of the keys, whatever, and they're normally just things that I've processed pretty heavily. So I think a lot of people get really into making many layers of stuff in the creative process, and doing lots of edits. And I think it's quite good in the final process to just put that all down as, a bunch of stuff, so you can't go back into that sort of detail and just then deal with it like a piece of music. It's made. You just got to then really get fun with the mix.
Yeah. Do you find, because it sounds like there's like a labor of love going on with the hardware, and we're sort of in a digital world, but you see, like I mentioned earlier, people kind of going back to hardware again. Do you find that there's a noticeable difference between hardware and digital, or do you think that maybe it's just a matter of preference? You feel more comfortable with hardware? Like, why not just do everything in box to play devil's advocate?
No. I do. I think it's really just down to a kind of the language that you've developed with your own stuff, so or where you're communicating that music to, so in terms of production, I now work with loads of people doing lots of sort of stuff, and so you take a sort of decision at certain points whether what's going to work. Some pieces of music you don't really want to be sending it back through the desk and doing that kind of treatment, because you want to keep something of that just real crisp digital in the box kind of production. It wants to stay in that area, and maybe you just want to take a vocal and you don't want to run it all through certain things that can date it, but what I do find works essentially when you're using outboard gear is you're adding these sort of harmonics or these plays in the frequencies that you can replicate it with an algorithm, but then it's there's something about the real things but that just do make a real difference, and also more than that is the fact that you're committing something down as a you're playing it through, so you can't then go back and tweak it again, you know. So maybe part of using outboard things is it helps, you know, people to kind of commit to the decision made.
Yeah, and take it more seriously.
Yeah, it's, you know, it's a bit like if you're using a pen and ink, you can't erase it, but if you're doing it in Photoshop, you can step back a bit. You know, so it's just that, you know, it's just that. But that, you know, I work on the box sometimes right up until you know, the last minute, and then it's like, okay, this is a really interesting composition. Now I'm just gonna put my, you know, my signature on it by treating all the parts in these various ways, you know.
Yeah. And a lot of times when you're doing, from my experience, when you're using outboard, especially just to get certain tones, it's just quicker, you know. Like a VST has a lot of stuff in front of you, but I mean, you gotta dick around with it, and it's sometimes you spend an hour, 2 hours on a VST. I love impulse responses, for example. You know, if I'm using I'm always using convolution reverb, because sometimes I've placed even entire submixes to, you know, a space, and just use that to balance in with the real thing. I've even had like an impulse response of a space just on an entire, you know, mix bus. And then there's certain like I love in the box sort of you know, precision EQing and you know, and basic bits of compression that can, you know, there's also, I mean, there's also certain amazing stereophonic, you know, things that you can get going, which are quite fun. But then, you know, that said, that, you know, recently I was working with someone lent me one of the new Eventide. You know, H9. It's just like a little white pedal, and I've got the old Eventide, and I'm used to using that and dialing through it. But then just having this little box next to me with a tap on it, you could just, I was using it on a reverb or something, and then just it has this tap button, so you're just playing through the song, just whacking this button, and it's just changing the speed that the delay is ricocheting around you, and then suddenly it becomes really good fun, because you're just like listening to the music, hitting your desktop as loads of different tempos. You're like, oh, I can try and find as many different like ways to sort of tap out this tempo of this strange verb I'm using. So I mean, there's some people who do that with you know, if you're really good at patching up your stuff, and then some people, you know, use controllers and they get that stuff going with their controllers, and then, which is great. But I just find that I can patch in wires much faster than I can sort of patch in sort of various controllers. So that's, you know. When you're playing live, do you bring a lot of gear with you, or?
No, well, actually, I mean, the live stuff I do, I think I clocked quite early that the thing that people really resonated with was the very sort of visual part of the performance. When I first started doing live, I was going out on stage with like that 8-track hard disc player, and I was doing it like a dub show. I was like that. I was live doing a live mix down, so people were really getting. And then I'd pick up a guitar and, you know, make noise over the top. And when it switched to laptops, I was like, I'd never felt comfortable with that on stage. So now I take just a real simple sampler on stage, which has lots of different layers of the tracks, sometimes just an entire backing track worked out, and then I just concentrate on playing instruments on stage. You know, I play bass, I play lots of flute, and then I've got a few, you know, effect sends, and I'm just working on the atmosphere and the performance, and, you know, because I think people, you know, used to going out clubbing now, and, you know, they don't, you know, they're happy to hear the beats and stuff coming nicely. You know, you don't have to. I think if you're there sort of like tweaking too much, it can work if you're doing a very sort of like dance music or something. But otherwise, you know, it's. I find, you know, there's a limit to how much you can be tweaking on a piece of gear to actually, you know, that's in the context of what I'm doing, of course, you know, which is, you know, I mean,
It keeps the continuity. Yeah. Like if you're tweaking too much, it's gonna fuck everything up, you know?
Yeah. Plus, I mean, it's good to travel light. I mean, I now travel basically with samplers, a sampler, a flute, bunch of weird effects, a bass guitar, and I developed a live set, which meant that I could turn up at like a strange warehouse party at 2:00 in the morning, and I can just be like, no, I'm just going to give you, and I've got a little desk, so I can give anyone like a stereo out at any point and just launch straight into a live show with instruments. You know, my bass guitar is going into my mixer, my mic for my flute's into my mixer, and I just So I like the set it up in 20 minutes and then get going and then just travel as well for sort of strange parties.
Yeah, what live sampler are you using?
I'm just literally using one one of the Roland. I can't even remember which one it is now. Like no, the newer one. Yeah, the newer one. Yeah.
All right. Well, someone will tell us.
I'm not very techie like that, you know.
Yeah.
I just load up the SIM card and go.
How did the Planet Mu release happen? Did you approach them, or they approached you, or?
Oh, in those days, there was like I had a cassette tape, and my housemate gave it to Mike Paradinas, of my first demos. There was only a handful of places where people would perform in London at the time, and so he was DJing at this cafe then, and that's how that happened. So. Such a long time ago now, but
the last three guests we had are Planet Mu alumni. So I guess it's just coincidence, I guess.
No, he's been very prolific in releasing stuff and like always picking up on things, and also he was quite stuff like that. It was a great time because I guess he was just I like this, I'll put it out, and and it just happened
and helped create a culture that. Various different subcultures that became more influential and dominant culture,
Yeah. I mean, I think I came into sort of like doing electronica just on the end of one sort of like massive era, and just as it was developing more, just as the internet was opening up. So, I think straight after that sort of era, and then came things like dubstep and also like a forums. I think Planet Mu had a big forum at the time. I think when that started, the few of us were on the label because there was like only about 4 of us on the label when I released. So when this forum started, we were just saying like this is really odd.
So you were on the forum? Were you talking to Hard Off?
I was on it, but then I can't say I was ever in the conversation. Okay. I was just looking at it. I mean, nowadays just being on an internet forum is just what everyone does every day of their life. Everyone's on. But it's funny to think at that point how that was a very interesting, when forums were opening up to. In fact, I did get very involved in other scenes online. I was quite inspired by the first, global bass music. In fact, I felt more of an affinity in what I did to when that all started communicating online, and when a lot of really amazing music started coming up from sort of South America and places like that. That was all being discovered through online forums, and that was a great, I was more sort of like following that than the more sort of strict sort of electronica forums, I have to admit,
Yeah. Well, those forums, I think people fail to remember that 2 decades ago, if you wanted new music, if you didn't live in a big city, you were screwed. You had to listen to whatever was on the radio. So those Planet Mu, We Are the Music Makers, AfixTwin.nu, Xeltronic, those places were a lifesaver for the hillbillies.
And it's fun. And I've been I've been searching out message groups recently and forums just as a nice way of finding new music, as well as there's one or two record shops which are like expertly curated, and I'm on their mailing list. So I think nowadays I think people are starting to realize that the idea of curation and sort of certain gatekeepers in terms of like curating or like reliable places to communicate is a good way of actually of discovering stuff still, because even that, I guess you have access to everything now, but you still need to be listening to some good heads to sort of like get nicely pointed out. And find really interesting stuff, because it's still quite exciting. It's always exciting looking for music, so that's part of I think why I'm still sort of actively involved in a lot of studio work and making music with people, because I'm still incredibly excited all the time by what I'm hearing or what's coming up.
Now that it's so easy, you don't need to drop 10 grand to make music anymore. You have so many more people creating music, so without those curators, good luck finding everything, because it's math. You're up against a math at this point. You're not going to be able to hear it all. I was going to ask you about the Latin American influence that you just spoke about. You were on other forums, sort of discovering what was coming out of Latin America. I am Colombian myself, and I sense the vibe in a lot of your tracks. I liked it with the 707. I was wondering what draws you towards the Latin American music aesthetic.
There's various parallels here, because I got into that. Well, I went to Argentina for a while, and then I started picking up on. I started hearing like cumbia villera and all these, pieces of music from there, and then it was the early point of people doing like digital cumbia, and when I first heard that stuff, I thought, oh, this is great. It reminds me of when I first got into like rave music, because I was just hearing like drum machines displaced or beats put in places where I wasn't used to, and then myself, I'm part Maltese, and we don't, I have a sort of like vague sort of like Latin connection that was always a bit sort of like, I could never quite work it out what it was. And then from the getting really into South American music, I rediscovered the flute. I was always playing the flute anyway, but then when I was younger, but then I got really into South American flute music and Andean music. And then that got me back into like playing a lot of flutes. And then I started suddenly getting into like, before that I was also always picking up on like a lot of Japanese music, which I think is quite environmental sounding as well. And then I ended up making an album called Andean Dub, which I think is about 2005, which was like basically a sort of me taking these sort of like cumbia beat, but I wanted it, more aggressive, a bit heavier, more repetitive. So I did an album of that, and what I found was really fun about that was these much slower rhythms, but they worked really great for dancing. So I was like, and then that music started to really free me up to kind of start throwing in kind of like more flutes to what I was doing, and more kind of bits of weird sounds, So I think that's how. Then from that, I brought it back to what I've been doing more recently, which is kind of like making a kind of like fictional music, which is a sort of based on some idea of like a Mediterranean, Southern Hemisphere music. So that's been a little journey that I went through, from discovering, more global music, but then wanting to get back to something that was more personal to me, rather than just, copying or trying to recreate a music from a culture other than my own, you know.
Yeah, and it's also original too, you know. Like if you're finding different inspirations that aren't just from IDM related, places, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Do you think it's more like are you inspired by the culture as well? Because for me, I feel like, especially with underground music, I think we really take for granted how much of culture underground music tends to shape in the long run. You know, you look at things from 20 years ago, 30 years ago, and now you see the ripple effect that it has on modern civilization. You know, I know it sounds a little grandiose, but do you feel that when you were searching for, I guess, other sounds, you were trying to make something new and something that's more impactful, or was it just more like an aesthetic thing?
I have to be honest, I've always been trying to do something original. I've always quite conscious of trying to do something that would create like a little ripple. But more, I'm always quite interested in how things find a similarity to relate to each other. So I think what music does is it helps to create an understanding, you know, between people, and I think music's always done that. I mean, I've been living in London now for most of my life. So here, you know, music works as a way of really bridging, you know, bringing people together from such a disparate amount of communities, and then you suddenly become aware that maybe your music tastes are a little bit narrow. You know, maybe you think, oh, hang on, I'm not really, haven't opened myself up to certain forms of music, because I wasn't making the effort to understand the culture that was, you know, that had created them. So I think so music has a way of, you know, opening up, understanding, and that's, you know, that I think is why it then creates a very positive change. And then of course certain movements that happen in music culture and club culture, they quite often they then make their way into society as a large. You know, I think it's funny now. I mean, how many people, you know, are now sort of like grown up who grew up like really raving, you know. So I think, you know, and having a great time with lots of different people. But you know, that said, you know, there's still some, you know, who knows? I think.
So there's one genre name that you're tied to, and I want to ask you this question. What is folktronica?
Yeah, well, I think it gets a real gets really knocked, doesn't it? Because I think at the time it was coined, that terminology I think it was a moment when the music press, which was still an entity then, was sort of obsessed with its self and its ability to kind of like lump everything into an area. But I mean, at the time, what that was it was really the first. People were just starting to use live instrumentation at the same time as using sequenced music, and as ridiculous as it sounds, at the time there was this sort of like divide. You know, it was literally like people were standing up there saying, "You are not allowed to use, you know, a computer and a sequencer and an acoustic guitar at the same time." You know, it was almost like mods and rockers or something. It was supposed, you know, there was this sort of like dumb idea that there was some sort of like cultural war going on between electronic music and live music. So I think then when people just started sampling acoustic instruments, and then because they were literally, I think it, you know, and then maybe there was this sort of idea that this was a sort of like quite nice, you know, homespun folkish thing, because it was not coming from, it wasn't being created by a sort of didact from some academy or some institution of music. It was like people would, if it's coming from, if some kid somewhere just starts sampling acoustic instruments and on electronic music, and they called it folktronica for that, and but what that grew into was actually no one sort of accused Richie Sakamoto of being a folktronica musician, or something like that. Or like there's been a constant movement of people working in, when they were first developing synthesizers like the Korg M1 and stuff like that, and digital synthesis, they were doing their best to program them to make these sort of quite interesting environmental sounds, so like and I still love these patches, it's a sound of like a reed bed, or like the wind in a set of trees with a pipe in the background or something, so people were using like very natural nature references in the early programming of synthesis. And synthesis was at times trying to recreate the sound of like of real instruments. So there's always been a folk in the terms of craft. There's always been a folk craft in electronics, and actually there's nothing more folk now than everyone being into modular synthesis. I mean, the fact that so many people are in their garden sheds now with modulars. I mean, to me, that's folk craft. That's like people being into knitting, and you're making things in your house, and you're
pottery.
Exactly. It's like you're working with your hands, and you're creating a music that speaks to you of your life. So that's folk.
Yeah, and a lot of these modular companies are one guy, just making the pieces himself. It's
exactly that's craft, So I think there's a strong link between craftsmanship and the idea of folk, I think. And also I think the interesting thing was at the time people used the word folk, knowing that it was actually supposed to be offensive. This idea that someone was folky was to be taken as an offence. I think it was used as a way of like a bit of like a diss. It was like, but then as if somehow being applying these sort of like folkish mentalities to your electronic instruments was sort of beneath the intelligence of some people. So anyway,
folk is very big. It's folk is cool now. And it's funny because you were mentioning that it was like mods versus rockers when it was like with live music or acoustic music with electronic music. It came down to even metal. Like if a band like Fear Factory, some people didn't like them because they used drum machines for their drums, right? And what a silly thing. And now all acoustic music is going through Pro Tools. So in theory, it's on paper, it's all electronic now. They're so processed and with drum triggers and all the VSTs. Yeah, it seems like a weird thing to sort of battle about. Yeah.
I mean, I'm seeing a lot now in live music scene that people are going back to, people really like experience, but they don't, but I love the hybrid of electronic to sort of performance that's happening now. It's fantastic,
Yeah.
I think we've finally got to that point where everyone's just beautifully mixing, electronic and live performance, and together.
Yeah. Do you think that the live experience now is sort of changed? It's been sort of, I guess, there's a formula to it, and everyone has the big projector screens and all this stuff. Do you find it's getting less dangerous than it would have been maybe a while ago?
Well, over the last few years, because I've been running this recording studio the last few years and working with a lot of artists, and I've seen a whole bunch of people go from early demos, first shows, local hype, little things, up to the point where in the last couple of years I've seen them play like at the biggest venues and doing world tours. So I've seen the shows, how they develop. And I have to say, I've not been disappointed yet in the way I've seen some people take stuff, to bigger and bigger. I think where it gets a little bit dry is when the big festival circuit, and I think sometimes people then need to sort of like find something very portable and very quick and transferable, and then you have an audience that's sort of like flicking from one thing to another. So unless it's if it's a really well curated festival, artful thing, then you might be surprised. But otherwise, I think, and these bands are having to work incredibly hard, and they're having to sort of like perform a lot and deliver a lot very quickly, to these sort of like big stages. So I think some people start to realize that it's, they want to sort of simplify things a bit, or just get things down to a certain like rehearsed T, I'm never visuals. I can give or take them, to be honest. It's like I never really zone in that much to when people use visuals. I don't, I think some people do it amazingly, and I think that's a real thing. I saw, that band Low? I saw them and at a festival, and their visuals were absolutely incredible, and they were using next to that like in their guitar sound, which is like just an incredible guitar sound with like modern effects units that types of fuzzes and broken frequencies that I haven't heard on a big PA before, with a incredibly striking light show. And then I was like, oh yeah, you've really gone to town with this. So some, I think it's down to everyone. If you're up for it, you can go to town. You can really push the boat out, and if you've got the opportunity to do that, you should do it, because it's it's high art that we're involved in. You want to you want to remember that. It's like, it's all very technical working in production, but we're artists, and you've got to keep in mind on being artists.
When from your experience working with these bands, for someone who's listening to this right now, who's just getting started, from farm to table, how would you play these big festivals? Like how would you approach that? Like how would you get there? How would you get the opportunity to play at these big festivals?
Well, it does all just come from, these days it does come from just a sort of fairly natural progression, which is from from having very strong local shows. It's that side of the things is still very much the same. Of course, it's still, you got to have, you have a show. There's still certain things like agents and stuff involved with a lot of that. Unless you're unless you go to the more DIY networks, but even then, it's like I think that stuff hasn't changed a great deal. Well, it's still like a lot of that is like a strong show in the networking. I can't really help people out with that, to be honest.
But when you say local shows, you're saying local from like London. You know what I mean, right? Like,
no, I'm spoiled.
Yeah.
I'm in London, so
okay.
I'm obviously I'm working as a record producer in London, so I see. I was checking out today, actually. I sent some music I was working on to somebody, and then he said, "Oh, this is very interesting." He said, "Oh, you should check out this collective in Cyprus," and he sent me a link to this record label in Cyprus, and I was looking at their events and their releases. And then they had a really nice archive online of a little festival and all the live shows they were doing in Cyprus. And I was just flicking through all this picture gallery of, like, you know, people making performances in strange places. And they look really, you know, and I was like, wow, I'm really fascinated. I really want to hear more of this stuff, you know. If they just walked into my town and performed that, I don't know if I necessarily would have been as drawn to it. I mean, narrative is very important, you know, these days. And like, if you're working, you know, part of the art form of working with music and production and getting all stuff made is like having a really strong narrative to the thing that you're doing. And it's the thing actually I always advise people who are maybe a lot of solo artists, or even people who are just not, you know, groups who are struggling to kind of pin down something. I'm like, well, what's the story of this piece, or what's the story of this band, or what's the story of this record, or what's the story of the, you know, behind the name of the project, you know, like, because if you, it's like, get a good narrative pinned down, and then you can sort of like ask yourself if what you're doing works within that sort of area, you know. So if something's draws you in because you're like, oh, that's really, I want to know more about this.
If you want people to be interested, you have to be interesting, right?
Yeah, it's the same. You know, your narrative could. I mean, on my last record that I made for myself, I allowed myself one set of drum samples. So I was like, okay, all my basic beats are going to be from this drum kit set of samples. I'm allowed to use this one. I'm allowed to layer up one layer of acoustic stuff, but I'm only going to use hollow objects, and I'm only going to use, you know, one synthesizer is allowed to be used. I'm only using this one type of synth, and I can only, you know, layer it a couple of times, and everything's going to just sound like these particular instruments working, and then everything is going to be, you know, and then I had a narrative that everything had to sort of have this sort of primitive melody to it. And so as soon as I had a melody that was maybe too modern, the piece was like left off the project, because it was like, oh, that's a bit too much like a pop melody. So I didn't want that, you know, I wanted to keep this very... so I made a really strong narrative, and then it was really easy to just go through the stuff, and also to tweak other things, you know, be like, oh, that's a really interesting piece, but what I have to do is remove these stuff from it and then add this other layer of percussion that I'm using. Then it becomes part of the same story of what I'm working on. So yeah, and then that's what draws me now into like finding, you know, music that I'm working with and recording, and I find a lot of people actually tend to come to the studio now with quite a sort of strong idea of what they're going to sort of try and make. I think the interesting thing now working in recording studios is because that's the point when people take their music away from just home production and get into you know, using a facility where they probably had to pay a bit of money to get in there. Yeah. And then with that, I'm recording people as well, so I've got a real responsibility to make sure they're not going to waste their time. So yeah. I'm always like, okay, well, before you come in here, you know, let's know exactly, let's get a good idea of what we're going to get done. And then when you're there and when you're creating music, you should just be in full creative flow. You know, you don't need to be, you know, if you're suddenly asking yourself the existential questions about the thing that you're doing, yeah. When you're in a recording studio, it's like, oh, you should have done that earlier, you know? Yeah. I think.
So on that note, what would you, for new artists, what are some things that you find new musicians, like what are the mistakes that they make when they go into the studio? What do you wish that all new musicians would sort of, I guess, figure out before they go to your studio?
Well,
like what are their pitfalls?
I mean, one of the things if I'm working with live music or a band or anyone that's been performing a lot, then the first thing is always, okay, well, you're really used to rehearsing your piece as a performance, or you're really used to it working in terms of an audience. But then I said, you have to bear in mind that this is now a recorded piece. So where you've been pushing the piece of music to get that kind of reaction in a live context might not necessarily be what is going to push the right buttons to the listener as a recording. Yeah. So I think it's very important people need to think about, the context of like, oh, actually we can, sit back on this, or actually we can pace this in a different way. We're not trying to get to that point so easily, or and then also I think overreaching for some sort of like strange sort of perfection of sort of technical performance over a sort of hot an emotive thing. So I think people need to be tuned into like getting a very sort of cliched, but a vibey performance, rather than just a sort of technical, technical sort of like a
like Rush.
Yeah.
Rest in peace, Neil Peart.
So I mean, that's all the simple things. I mean, although I'm now, I'm slightly blessed now, because I'm tend to work with a lot of people who are a little bit more, down the line with recording, and then very young artists I'm working with. The way I've done it is like the first time we recorded in a studio, I tried to have as little impact on them as possible until I totally understand them and what they're doing, because I don't want to be a producer in the wrong way. I don't want to just go, okay, well, this is the way I do things and you're going to do them my way now. A lot of the time I'll just set up, I worked with a duo recently, they work with drum machine, live sampler, saxophone and vocal, and they've very free improvised the arrangements. So as they were hearing themselves back, they could suddenly, over the course of, we would record the same piece of music like 5 times in a row, like 5 variations of the improvise of the song. And then just trying to be very delicate in the way that you're making suggestions which enhance, you can spot where people are picking up in the right place their own performance, and you give, giving people confidence to make the good decisions for themselves and what they're doing. That's what I do, rather than saying, oh, that's all wrong, or you should do it like that. I'm like, oh, actually that's really great what you're doing there, and you can concentrate on that and not feel so much like you have to try and be a star of that other role at that point. You can just really have the confidence that you'll play, don't feel like you have to. So I think it's a bit like that, and then you just draw out the kind of like natural strengths of things. I guess you have to work in the same way with your own self if you're working on making music, Yeah,
that is very sound advice. Christian, thank you so much. I think we're nearing the end. I don't want to take your whole day here. But before we go, I have one last question I want to ask you before we finish up. How do you make a good mix? What do you recommend to producers? What are the pitfalls? I just discovered that you can mix with like pink noise now. I don't know if that's like something that everybody knew before. Yeah.
Well, my current thing, I mix extremely quietly. So I work on, when I get to my mix, I'm working on very, very low volume level. And so I think you can work on a mix just blasting something out of the speakers, and I think you're just battering yourself. So I think a lot of the time the way to get a mix good is you have to turn it up at times, or you can just be a bit like just to hear how certain things are reacting. But I think actually just working quite delicately, and I even do that if I'm doing like a dub mix, even if I'm working like a live mix with a lot of weird effects and stuff like that. I get to the point where I try to work I can work very quietly, because sometimes because you can hear, what you can hear what you want to be happening at a quiet volume. Then you're not getting this human compression that happens because your brain's being assaulted by so many things at the same time. You can only process so much information, and the ear
fatigue too.
Yeah, exactly. So I've found now that I can, that for me, that working quite at a gentle volume, finds I can sort of really get interesting thing, and then at certain points just suddenly bringing it up into the room and just listening to it much louder, and just suddenly and then I'm hearing it afresh, and I think a good thing to do, to always bear in mind with a mix, you should always have some things that are just like a bit louder than you think they should be, and there always should be some things that are just a bit quieter than you think they should be, because it's do you know what I mean? You just like, sometimes you're like, oh god, actually that ring really just jumps out and smashes you at that point, but actually that's a great thing, or that thing's really tucked away there, but it's like, oh yeah, but maybe. So sometimes you can trick yourself into I think people can get too much just trying to make everything completely level. I think you can imagine it like a bunch of people in a room, doing what they're doing. Some things are going to be at the back of the space, just so that's my bit of advice on that.
Excellent. Yeah, when everything's leveled, you lose a lot of dynamics too, and it's weird.
You got a demo.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Well, thank you for your time, and thank you for the interview. It was a great conversation, Christian.
Thank you.
Is there anything you'd like to plug? Is there any future projects coming up, or that we might have talked about before?
I mean, do keep track on my new material. I'm releasing a mini album on the 10th of April. It's going to be called Bird Trapper. That's my next release, and there's going to be the first single dropping from that at the end of February, a track called Temple. That's all going to be on my Bandcamp site, and it will be on all the big digital servers as well, and limited edition transparent vinyl that I'm issuing on my label for that as well. And that's my next personal release, and then apart from that, just keep track of the Discogs page under my name, capital K, and the recording studio I'm in is called Total Refreshment Center, Total Refreshment Studios. We've got a playlist on Spotify actually there, because we've got so much music coming through the studio, so there's a lot of really interesting music there as well. So,
and people can book time there if they'd like, or
we're a London studio, and then we do a lot of jazz bands, a lot of weird, wonderful records there.
Excellent.
So
great. Well, thank you very much. And
my pleasure.
That's it. Thank you everybody for listening, tuning into this one, and go follow capital K Christian at his links and his social media. What's your social media? Is it under capital K?
Yeah, capital K. Yeah.
Excellent. All right. Thanks. Bye-bye, everybody.